Good evening and welcome. My name is Bren Carlil and I am the Director of Public Affairs at the Zionist Federation of Australia. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I speak, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Knowing that this conversation is being watched in every Australian state, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands on which people are watching this. Before I introduce tonight's guest, I want to briefly tell you about next week. We've only got a couple more lockdown learning conversations left this year, and these will be filled with great guests. Next week, we'll be speaking with Yohanan Plesner, who is the president of the Israel Democracy Institute, a non-partisan think tank that partners with government, policy, and decision makers to improve the functioning of Israel's government and institutions while preserving civil liberties and fostering solidarity within Israeli society. Now, one of the things the Israel Democracy Institute does very well is monthly polling of Israelis. And in my dissertation, I use that polling data extensively. So I'm a big fan of the Institute and I am looking forward to next week's conversation. But that's then and this is now. Tonight, we'll be speaking with Jordana Cutler. She has a really impressive CV. Indeed, the Jerusalem Post labeled Jordana one of its 50 most influential Jews of 2020. She's the head of policy for Israel and the diaspora at Facebook. And before that, she was the chief of staff at Israel's embassy in Washington. And before that, she worked in Bibi's office as the head of his diaspora policy team. Now, we all know Facebook, of course, and we all know its reach and influence. Facebook has been a real marvel at bringing people together, but it's also had its challenges, as have the other social media platforms, due to the ever-present virus of hatred that some are intent on spreading. Now, we'll be talking about all of that with Jordana tonight, and to talk with her is my friend and colleague, Emily Gion, who is the ZFA's Director of Communications. Emily, take it away.
Thank you, Bren, and thank you so much, Jordana, for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, our pleasure. So welcome to Australia. At the moment with our Sky shut, it's probably the only way you're going to get here. I like to always start off with just a little bit of a sort of background about how you've been going during these COVID times, during these crazy COVID times.
Oh, thank you so much. And I know that you guys in Australia haven't always had it so easy. And I know that the lockdown just ended in Melbourne. And so congratulations to everyone who can leave their homes, go to synagogue and to shops and see friends. As I'm sure you guys have been following, it's been up and down here in Israel. I'm a parent of 3 kids who've sometimes been in school and haven't been in school. And so to all the parents out there who know exactly how I feel, I've been going through that also. Today is one of those days where, though I also will just say we had some rain, which is wonderful. In Israel, we woke up in the middle of the night to some thunder, but other people woke up in the middle of the night to hearing rockets and the Iron Dome going off. So anyone who was enjoying their Sunday and might have missed the news, there was a barrage of rocket fire. So I just want to say my heart and thoughts are out to all the people out there in Ashdod and Bat Yam and other cities that did not have a good night because of what's going on. So in addition to, of course, everything going on with COVID and Corona, we have our day-to-day other challenges here in Israel that not every other country has to face. So thank you for asking. And again, I'm really happy to be here with you guys this evening in Australia.
It's so interesting that you say that, because I think during this situation, especially, like, we're so caught up in the COVID situation or in the health situation and in the, we're at home and the family and whatever, that you sort of forget that in Israel, every day, like obviously everywhere, everyday life sort of does carry on, but not really. And in this situation, it's, you don't think about the daily sort of issues that Israelis face in terms of rockets, in terms of, the security situation over in the West Bank and things like that. So it is important to acknowledge. I wanted
even
to
go into a mall and they go to check your bag and you're like, oh, are you wearing gloves? Did you wash your hands? All these little things that you're extra cautious with, they have like an extra layer in Israel. But yeah,
that's so true. I didn't even think of that one either. Before we get into all of the Facebook stuff, I think, it's you're coming at us from Israel, but as everyone can tell, you do have an American accent. And I'm always interested to hear about people's sort of Aliyah story and how they grew up and what sort of brought them to make Aliyah. So I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your life growing up in the States, and then sort of what led you to your Aliyah story.
Of course, I'm happy to share it. And, I think a lot of people come and ask my story thinking, what can I do when I move to Israel? And so I'm happy to share it in hopes that maybe it will encourage other people to have a successful Aliyah. I grew up in a very traditional American Jewish home, 5th generation Washingtonian, actually, which is quite rare for Jews in the United States. And I had a very, privileged Jewish life in that I went to a Jewish day school for 13 years. I went to synagogue every week and was in my youth group at the synagogue. I went to Jewish sleepaway camp, which is a big issue for us, a very great thing to have. And in my senior year in our Jewish day school, we went to Israel for the last 3 months. We graduated early and went to Israel, volunteered on a kibbutz. It was February to June of 2000, before the second Intifada. We were there with a lot of freedom. And really that whole time, we were on kibbutz Eliyahu for part of that time, really connected me to Israel. And I thought, I have to make Aliyah. But I had been accepted to college at Brandeis University and went back to the United States, knowing in my heart that in the future, I really would like to make Aliyah. I got to spend my junior year abroad in 2002, 2003 at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, which again was also a privilege. It was the year of the bombing in the Frank Sinatra cafeteria. Yeah. And there were only about 45 of us that whole year in the entire overseas program. I think the year before it had been in the hundreds. And all of us really grew very connected to one another and to Israel. Many of us from that class have made Aliyah. We're still in touch today, which is really beautiful. But that really said to me, okay, it's like one more step. I'm almost ready to come. And after I graduated, I felt that it would be best to come to Israel with a little more work experience. I worked really hard to get a job in the Israeli embassy in Washington, thinking that what better experience would it be than to meet a lot of Israelis. And I was really privileged to meet the economic attaché in the embassy at the time, who was Ron Dermer. Many people hadn't heard of him at the time. I was a bit of a fan. He was the author of The Case for Democracy with Natan Sharansky. Yeah. Went up to his office, knocked on the door. And from that moment, he really became a mentor to me. And really helped me to, when thinking about my career and my Aliyah, what to do. He ended up hiring me, and I worked for him for almost 8 years. So I always wanted to move. Again, that 17-year-old Jordana who wanted to make Aliyah, very idealistic, was a little different than the 25-year-old Jordana who had come in with a little more experience, knowing what I wanted to do, knowing what I was passionate about. And that really helped to make my Aliyah successful, kind of bringing that dream from my childhood to a more realistic reality.
Yeah, that sounds really sensible and a great way to do it. And so now I don't want to jump too far ahead, but I do want to talk for the most part about your time at Facebook. So we will go back to your time in Washington and your time with Bibi, but you're the head of policy for Israel and the Jewish diaspora at Facebook. Can you tell us exactly what that means and what your job day to day entails?
Of course. So just for background, I've been at Facebook since 2016. I actually started on 3 months exactly after my daughter was born, when I was in Washington, and I saw a link to a job in Israel saying head of policy for Facebook in Israel. What does that even mean? I didn't really know. And Facebook's policy teams at the time were quite small. And long story short, I applied for this job randomly online, came back to Israel with a job at Facebook. And my job has changed a little bit just as the company has changed. But as you guys might know, in Australia, we have teams in Sydney and many offices around the world, London, France, etc. I could name many, where we have public policy teams. And the purpose of that person is to really both represent Facebook and our policies to that country, to those policymakers and to communities there, but also to be the voice of that place and those people back inside of the company. Facebook obviously is a very big company. We have over 3 billion people using our services every month. And we need to know what's going on in the places that we're operating. So in my case, for example, before I started my job, we had a team in London who was kind of following what was going on in Israel and the Knesset, what our teams were doing in Tel Aviv, but there wasn't really a connection between a local policy person, the policy background, to speak into the company about what was happening in Israel, obviously a very important market to us. So my job has been to be the voice for both Facebook and for Israel back inside of the company. Back in March, I added kind of another job into what I do, which is to also have the Jewish diaspora as a priority in my work. As everybody on this call knows, people in this organization know that the connection between Israel and the diaspora is almost natural. It's known to all of us. But it wasn't really something that we focused on inside of the company as a theme of a community that we were focused on. We had our teams in France and in Canada and London and the United States working with Jewish communities in their local countries, doing really wonderful things with the Jewish community. But it wasn't necessarily connected to either Israel or the Jewish communities to one another. And so what I've done in this role is to try to give more of a strategic vision to how we're working with the Jewish community. As you all know, the issues you're facing in Australia when it comes to either connecting as a community or fighting anti-Semitism are very similar and connected to Jewish communities in other places in the world. So my goal is to help strengthen those local policy teams and give them more background and understanding into the issues that the Jewish community is facing, just like we do with many other communities. We have teams focused on LGBTQ, on women's issues, on many other minorities. And so my goal, in addition to working with Israel, is to also do this for the Jewish community.
That's really interesting. And I think, we've been seeing the power, the power of Facebook's obviously, it's exploded over the years. But I think that during COVID especially, even just our chat tonight, which is going live on Facebook, we've been doing this. This is the 31st session of our lockdown learning. So we've been doing it since the start of April, nearly every week on Facebook, except for over the Chagim. And it's really been, one of the big tools in bringing the community together in the diaspora. It's been great in terms of us being able to link up with different groups around, Jewish groups around the world, and particularly in Israel. And, we've seen that it's been able to help Jews connect to Israel, get support for Israel, defend Israel from unfair criticism. Does your office work with people who are working on a grassroots level to counter unfair criticism to Israel? Like, we have certain groups here who seem to monitor what's going on and have, like, everybody has to report this. Does your office work with people like that to get a better understanding of what they're facing?
Yes, and it's not, I do that for sure, and many of my colleagues do that with many communities. I'll say, basically what you touched on, I think, are two important things. One, the work that we do with those communities can be focused on counter speech, positive, proactive campaigns to unite and get people together, connecting people to places that are far away. Obviously, for us here on this call, Israel would be one of those places. That's one pillar of the work. The second pillar is what I would call that more content-focused work, which is focused on hate speech, criticism, bias, things that people don't like when it comes to our content policies. And so, of course, we focus on that as well. I would put that in, fighting anti-Semitism and things like that. And I think both of those are very important. I don't think that one should negate another just because we can have, a tough conversation with the Jewish community about the way that we're fighting hate speech doesn't mean that we also can't help to make sure that they can have an amazing experience on a Facebook Live event with people in Israel at the same time. And I think those things come together in many different ways. Just an example, we were helping to support March of the Living, did a Kristallnacht campaign last week for that anniversary. And, there's many issues when we talk about, that campaign, fighting hate speech and anti-Semitism online, but also using the power of our platform to get thousands of people around the world to use their hashtag #LetThereBeLight and, focus on fighting those things as well. And I think both of those are really important. Hearing from communities is really important. And I've really helped to establish what I would call more structured roundtables with different groups in the Jewish community. And I'm really excited now that we've had a connection, and hopefully we'll be doing this more with you, to bring Jewish communities together, have them around the table and talk to us about what they're hearing, and also use that opportunity to explain to them things that we're doing, from basic updates when it comes to how our ads work, what kind of transparency measures we require when people are using different products and tools, and also hearing from them, what does that mean when it comes to our policies and things that you're not happy about, and how can we change them? And so both of those pillars are, I would say, key to what I do with the Jewish community.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting. Well, I'll get back to that in a second, but just going on along the same lines of the COVID thing, did you see an uptick of anti-Israel related content during COVID, or anti-Semitic as well, but anti-Israel?
Well, what I can say is we don't have specific numbers to look at this period about specific issues, one or another. But we did see that there were a lot of new trends coming during COVID, right? So one of them would be like Jews caused coronavirus, and so that was something that, while, there's always been anti-Semitism in the world, this was a new form of that, to say that, we invented coronavirus, not new to say that Jews were inventing disease and spreading it around the world. We've been seeing that since the Middle Ages. But what is important there is that we kept ahead of those trends as much as we could. Obviously, we can't predict what kind of hate will happen. But as soon as we saw those, we worked very closely with our policy teams to make sure we were removing that kind of speech, and also making sure that people had accurate information about what was going on in coronavirus. So I think one of the important things that we did first was our Coronavirus Information Center, to make sure that people knew just medically how to get accurate information. We did that locally in every country that we operate in. So here in Israel, for example, we worked closely with both the Ministry of Health and Magen David Adom, who are an important partner in getting those coronavirus tests, blood donations, et cetera. And then on top of that, making sure that harmful misinformation about coronavirus was removed from our platform so that people weren't going to be injured. And so I think there's kind of, again, more than one element to the different trends that we saw with coronavirus. So one, making sure people had accurate information, and two, making sure that the hateful elements coming out during that time period were coming down. And I'm pretty proud. I think we did a very good job when it came to that.
And was there an uptick at all in, and I know you said it's hard to measure the trends, but in sort of pro-Israel stuff over that time, or?
Well, again, mostly, I can share anecdotal experiences. Yeah. We don't have data. What I can say is, just from the people I worked with, I found that many more people were looking and seeking to be online to connect with one another and focusing on content online because there was less people meeting in person, right? And so I suddenly had phone calls from organizations saying, do you think we could do a conference using virtual reality with Oculus? Like, if you can't come to Israel and all come together and have your, groups, conference, seminar, or visit Israel, which is obviously a key component of, the relationship between many Jewish communities in Israel, is visiting Israel. How can we do that via other means? And so I felt, again, just saying anecdotally, that many more people were reaching out and eager to speak to us about how to use our tools for things like that, in addition to building stronger Facebook communities and for fundraising. Our fundraising tools really have helped people during this kind of time of financial crisis keep organizations and different people afloat.
We've just had a question here. When you say we, do you mean Israel or the US Facebook company? But I'm assuming you mean the Israeli US Facebook. The Israeli Facebook. Yeah.
Yeah, so again, speaking on behalf of, I'm employed by Facebook, but I represent Facebook in Israel and also Facebook to the Jewish diaspora. So Facebook as a company, and the things that I've done in the company, when I say we, when I do something with the Jewish community, that's with the support of Facebook. And I think actually on that question, it's really important to note that when I came to our leadership and said, we have people focused, we have a position in the company focused on the African diaspora, for example. When I came and said, I'd like to focus on the Jewish diaspora, that was really embraced by the company. And I think that says a lot about, what the company believes in and what they want to support, because they were very supportive of us wanting to help the Jewish community in this way.
Yeah, it's really important. I think during this time as well, I found it interesting, and this is also just anecdotal, but through our Facebook page, what people liked, especially at the start of COVID, when there was a lot of fear and a lot of uncertainty about the world and everyone was shutting down and lockdown all over the world, people loved the positive stories from Israel. And I noticed that no one wanted to read any doom and gloom. But the second I posted on Facebook something about, you know, a bar that donated all the food because it was going to go bad, or, you know, the people singing across the balconies. And I know they did it in every country, but like there was something really special about the vibe in Israel at that time, and the way I saw it played out on social media, which I felt was really special. And I felt that showed, and maybe it's just the circles that I move in on Facebook or whatever, but I felt like it was being shared in a lot of places. And I felt like that was a really positive aspect of the, you know, of the forum of Facebook in that way. So it's not all just doom and gloom. It's it's also the positive as well.
Yeah, and what I said earlier, you know, it's not to say that to focus on the positive is to negate that, of course, there can be hateful content or bad content on our platform. And that's why we're investing so much. And I'm sure you'll ask me more about that. But,
yes.
You know, I think it's important to look at both. And that's why when I talk to Jewish communities, I think it's important that we focus on both of those. And I think growing really strong, impactful Facebook communities and groups on our platform does so much good. It doesn't mean that, you know, we're going to then disregard hateful content. I think that they're both really important, one next to another.
Yeah, so I think we'll move on to that for a little bit. So just in terms of online anti-Semitism, or what is, and also unfair criticism of Israel, what is Facebook's policy on these issues?
Sure. So we have very robust policies. We call them community standards. And I would say that our fight against anti-Semitism is not a look at one specific policy, but at all of those policies acting in concert with one another. Those policies, for example, include things like bullying and harassment, credible violence, threats, incitement to violence, hate speech, of course, a very important policy called dangerous organizations and individuals, which focuses on people's behavior in addition to just the content they post. And all of those policies working together have in mind how to keep anti-Semitism off of the platform. And they're constantly developing. So if we look back, it's always been important for Facebook to keep hate speech and anti-Semitism off the platform. But just as people's use of our platform has changed over time, so have our policies, and they're constantly changing and developing. So as I mentioned earlier, we deal with different communities around the world to talk about our policies. This is something we don't just do with the Jewish community, but with every single community that could be negatively impacted by our policies. We talk to them in structured meetings to really hear from them what they think our policies are striking the right balance on and where we need to improve. And so we started doing this about a year and a half ago with the Jewish community in a much more structured way. We were always doing it, and really wanted to kind of zero in on where people felt that we weren't getting enough content when it came to anti-Semitism. I would say the big moment of where we started to make huge change was this past August, when we included in our policies what we called designated dehumanizing comparisons of specific people. So in our hate speech policy, we've always protected people based on what we call their protected characteristics. So that could be race, religion, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, disability, there's a list of them. And we've always protected those people against statements of inferiority, dehumanizing comparisons, for example, but they weren't specific for each protected characteristic. Our policies are global. So we protected anyone from being called filthy, dirty, disgusting, based on their protected characteristic. What we discovered was really missing, and the way to solve this through these roundtables with the Jewish community was that there were harmful stereotypes that were specifically targeted at the Jewish community that we were not getting down. And so in August, when we added these harmful stereotypes, we now include in our hate speech policy content that claims that Jews run the world or major institutions. These are, it can include banks, the economy, Hollywood, et cetera. This, as you know, and many of the people watching here know, is anti-Semitism, but it was kind of a gap in our policy. We were basically protecting people against statements of inferiority and missed those statements of superiority, which specifically when targeted to Jews feel different to us. And that policy change, I think, was a really big step in helping to take down anti-Semitism off of Facebook. And then, of course, a few weeks ago, we made an even bigger policy announcement, which I think is really industry leading and really brought other companies to follow us, which was to then remove content that denies or distorts the Holocaust. And I think it's important that we included Holocaust distortion in addition to just Holocaust denial. We looked at, these conversations with the Jewish community. We, of course, took a lot of inspiration from both the spirit and the text of the IRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, and use these in coordination with really following trends of the real world, data about what people know about the Holocaust, the kind of real world anti-Semitism that's happening, to make sure that our hate speech policy was robust enough to be removing hate speech against Jews or Israelis. And in addition to that, the other policies I mentioned are also just as important. So I think following also what we do with that dangerous organizations and individuals policy is just as important. That policy removes people from Facebook, not because of certain posts that they wrote on Facebook, but because of activity that they have off of Facebook. So that takes off somebody in France, a hateful anti-Semitic comedian, for example, named Jordana, people like Richard Spencer, Louis Farrakhan, et cetera, who are kind of maybe not using our platform for anti-Semitism, but who are anti-Semitic in the real world. That policy comes in and removes people and terrorist organizations, for example, from having any presence on our platform. And so I think, again, that's just one example. All of those policies in coordination with one another and with people speaking to us from the Jewish community help to keep that kind of hate off of our platform.
And just in terms of that, because does somebody have to report the content for it to be removed, or is there some sort of algorithm that catches it before someone has to report it?
Thank you for asking that. It's so important, and I think many people don't understand, so thank you for asking. We have a combination of both human review and technology. We actually share numbers about this in our transparency report. We started these transparency reports a few years ago, and every quarter we try to give more detailed information so that people have an idea of what we're removing. So as an example, we talked about in our last, in Q2 of this year, that we removed 22.5 million pieces of content for hate speech. Again, that's hate speech against the whole gamut of hate speech. But 94% of that we removed without people having to report it to us because of our proactive tools. Now, that doesn't mean that in terms of sheer numbers, that rest of the 6% isn't a large amount of content. And that's why we still rely on people to report content to us. Technology is only good to a certain level. For example, in the beginning, it was great at pornography. It was just images, and you could kind of train a machine to see pornography and understand, what to look at. But hate speech is so contextual. So when you post something, for example, on Facebook, you're actually allowed to post hate speech if you're condemning it. You're allowed to take something hateful and share it in order to demonstrate that there's a hateful phenomenon out there and try to teach people against it. So there's never usually a blanket ban on things that are hateful if shared in the proper context. So it might feel very different if the ZFA is sharing content about Hamas, or if a Hamas page is sharing content about Hamas, but they shouldn't actually be on Facebook at all. That context is very important to us. So it's why we are training and using technology to take down as much of this content as we can before people have to see it, before that harm is done to the person that sees the hateful content. But we also still rely on people using Facebook to report content to us. And any piece of content on Facebook is something that you can report. A page, a group, a comment, anything, a picture, all can be reported. It will be sent to human review, and a person will review that. We make mistakes in that process, and I'm sure everybody here has felt that we made a wrong decision. It's why we've tried over time to give as much information as possible about that process, and also give appeals. So now we have an appeal process. If you think we've made the wrong decision, you can appeal that. It will be sent to a different person for review. And again, that combination is really important because we still require people to be able to understand the nuance of hate speech. In the future, hopefully we'll get to a place where those violating pieces of content will never be seen. But unfortunately, 94%, while pretty good, I think it would be an A or an A+ in some places, still leaves up some of that content, which is why we have 35,000 people working on safety and security around the world on our platform.
Yeah, it's interesting because I used to report a lot of things and I would find that I'd almost straight away get back, we've reviewed it and found that it didn't violate any of our community guidelines. And then somebody said to me, like you can say something at the bottom, was this helpful or did this answer something like that? And you could do it and it would then get reviewed. And I found that in the last few years, it definitely, when something's been reported, more things seem to be getting taken down. So there must be something that's something that's working well there in that sense. I just wanted to go back. You briefly mentioned the IHRA. Is there a reason why Facebook didn't adopt the working definition?
Yeah, it's a question I'm asked a lot. I think that it's very important that we use the IHRA definition to inform our policies, but our policies need to be things that are operational and actionable in our platform. The IHRA definition, if we go back, and we've spoken to many people who've been involved in the definition. I think all of their advice has been very valuable to us. The definition is written in a way that's focused on countries and also on how to acknowledge real world crime and things that are happening offline. It's not an internet definition. It's also not a definition about what should be removed and not removed when it comes to freedom of expression. So the definition is obviously very helpful in finding a balance between where something crosses the line into anti-Semitism. But I think the reason that only countries have adapted this definition is because it helps to inform things like local police officers, law enforcement, court systems about when a crime, for example, might be a hate crime, is an example, but it doesn't necessarily help to action content on Facebook based on this definition. So I think it's important to look at when we talk about our policies and our community standards, that means that content is removed. Some content on Facebook, while it might be wrong or a lie or offensive, we leave up on Facebook and hope, as I mentioned earlier, that people use that to shine light on a problem or a phenomenon and to use counter speech to educate against it. It also might mean that at times we encourage people to find accurate information about something, even if we're not removing the lie itself. This is an area, for example, where we're moving towards in Holocaust denial and distortion. Part of the announcement we made a few weeks ago, and this is something I'm very excited about personally because I think it will make a huge difference when it comes to educating people. We're removing information about Holocaust, anything that has Holocaust denial and distortion, and this will take some time to ramp up and be perfect when it comes to enforcement, as we were talking earlier. So people are reporting content on that. I just want to note that it might take some time for our systems to be better at removing that. But let's say we're in a place where that content isn't on Facebook. It doesn't mean that somebody isn't typing into our search box, Auschwitz, gas chambers, looking for information about something. And so what we want to do is encourage people to find accurate information about the Holocaust, whether they're looking for something on a malicious reason, maybe they're typing in something like Holohoax, or maybe they're just actually curious as to what happened in Auschwitz. We will encourage people to leave Facebook and go to a third-party website with credible information about the Holocaust and learn about it. And so again, when we look at these kind of trends when it comes to anti-Semitism, I think it's important that we be nuanced in where we're removing content and where we want to encourage people to go find accurate information. And that's what we'll be doing by the end of the year with the Holocaust. And where we want to rely on organizations and advocacy groups like yourselves to shine light on problems and on content that you think is wrong or misguided, a hoax, for example. And we want to encourage you to also use the power of our platform to share the truth about those things. And so that's why, going back to your question, I think IHRA is inspirational in terms of educating us. That's why in our August announcement, when it came to these harmful stereotypes, our language is actually almost word for word from IHRA because we use IHRA. But I don't think that taking private companies and having them sign on to the IHRA definition would necessarily help in the fight against anti-Semitism.
Yeah, there probably needs to be, as you said, a little bit more nuance when it comes to things like online and all the rest. And has Facebook defined, or at least internally, where sort of the anti-Zionism, anti-Israel comments end and anti-Semitism begins? Because in real life as well, there's obviously sometimes a fine line, and it's hard to define. But is there some sort of a policy within?
Well, so it's a great question. It's obviously very important, and I'm sure that you guys know that better than other people. I'm sure that Jews all around the world know that when somebody calls them a Zionist on the street, they probably haven't really looked into whether they believe in Herzl's philosophy or whether they're just using that word as a proxy for being Jewish or Israeli, perhaps. And so our policies actually do take that distinction into consideration. When it comes to this word Zionist, for example, we, as I mentioned, want to protect people in our hate speech policies for being targeted against their protected characteristics. And so that would include somebody for being Jewish or Israeli. And we understand, again, not just in this context, but in other contexts, people can use proxy words to attack somebody without using those words. We understand that Zionist is one of those words, which is why our policy does have nuance when it comes to attacks on a Zionist. Is it using that term to mean a political philosophy or idea, which we do allow attacks on, or is it attacking somebody because they're Jewish or Israeli? And so we use context in those kinds of posts. If we understand from the post that it's being used to attack somebody for being Jewish or Israeli, we will remove that. And I think that's really unique that a tech company like Facebook actually has discussions and meetings and looks into this line of where Israel, anti-Zionist content might bleed into anti-Semitism and where it might just be fair criticism of government policy, for example. One of the interesting, things that someone mentioned to me is content, that says Israel is racist. And it feels very different when it says Israel is racist and it has, images that might be of, the IDF or some kind of, military. Or if it says Israel is racist and it's written in Hebrew by Ethiopians at a rally focusing on racism and what they believe might be Israeli government policy, that feels different. And that's why we have to take all of that context into consideration when we look at these kind of critiques of Israel and where they might be an Israeli critiquing their country and where it might actually be an anti-Semitic attack. And that's something that we're constantly doing with the Jewish groups and the roundtables that I mentioned, along with many other communities.
Yeah, we've got a question here about BDS, which asks, have you barred BDS input on Facebook? And I think this sort of feeds in a little bit to what that sort of fine line between anti-Israel, anti-Semitism, because I find a lot of the BDS content to be really vile anti-Semitism. What is sort of the policy on BDS material on Facebook?
Well, so we would look at the content based on, again, not taking a stand on a movement or a specific person, but on the content itself. And so boycotting products or anyone is allowed if it's not, again, targeting personal characteristics. So again, targeting Israelis, boycotting Israeli people, boycotting Jews would not be allowed on Facebook. When it comes to the state of Israel and products from Israel, just as it would be from any other country around the world, we would have to take into consideration in that post all the different factors. What is it targeting? What is it attacking? Again, many pieces of content have many attacks at once, right? So you can have a critique of the state of Israel, but then also praising Nazis. You could have many different things. And we look at captions, photos, comments, we look at everything. So it's hard to kind of give just we allow this or we don't allow it. But I guess the important thing to note here is that we would make a distinction based on attacking a nation or a state and people based on their protected characteristics.
Yeah. We've had a question here. Actually, I might just, before we move on to that, I wanted to just go back a little bit to the interplay between free speech and preventing hatred. Some might say that Holocaust denial is free speech, and in the US, free speech is sacrosanct. How does Facebook navigate this? The switch between it all.
It's very hard, and if anyone was watching me online just 2 months ago, I could have been doing the same kind of talk and defending to you why we were allowing Holocaust denial and distortion, even though I've known that we're in a process of, evaluating it and looking at it, as we do all of our other policies. This is why this is fluid and these policies change. I'm sure that many of you know that, our CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, explained that Holocaust denial was going to remain on Facebook only a few years ago, because we didn't want to be the arbiter of the truth, and we wanted to take down content that was harmful and hateful. But when it came to denying facts of history, we were going to leave that up. What's unique about the Holocaust, and what we came to the decision on here, was that even content that is denying facts and lying about the Holocaust was hateful content. That's why it's in our hate speech policy. I think it's important when we talk about this change that Facebook made, we didn't put it in a misinformation policy. We have a policy called harmful misinformation, for example. We didn't put this there. We put it under hate speech because we understood that we needed to change and adapt. We change and adapt our policies all the time. So I would say that it's not newsworthy that we adapted our policy. We're always adapting our policies, but understanding that balance of when content that is just wrong becomes hateful is difficult. Obviously, we're focused here, you asked about Holocaust denial, but this happens to many people around the world with many issues that they disagree with or find hateful and harmful around the world, and we have to evaluate all of them. It's important for me to say that we always removed content that was mocking the Holocaust, that was taking victims of the Holocaust and mocking them, calling for another Holocaust, calling for genocide. But the reason Facebook has made this change into removing all of Holocaust denial and distortion is because we understood that the world changed. We needed to change, just like, we do on many other policies. And so I'm really proud that we got to this place.
Yeah. Look, I noticed especially over the last 2 weeks during the American election, and don't worry, I'm not going to get into American politics, but I noticed, for example, on Twitter, that, there was a few posts, for example, that President Trump put up that had then some sort of disclaimer that said something like, this claim about election fraud is disputed. Does Facebook have anything like, I haven't noticed anything, but does Facebook have anything like that when it comes to either like elections or Holocaust style hate speech, or would they prefer to just remove it rather than have a disclaimer on it?
Well, so I
think
not
Trump. Sorry, I didn't.
Yeah, no, that's fine. It's okay. It's hard to not talk about elections these days. I had to work with 3 Israeli elections, one after another. All the issues that the U.S. teams have been focusing on, I was like, that was so 2019 for me. But what we did actually was take candidates or anyone writing about the election, and we put a link to authoritative information about the election. I think that's different than taking a stance on whether something is right or wrong, but just encouraging people to make sure that they have the resources for accurate information. So we had an election information center in the United States that we encouraged people to go to and find accurate polling information, et cetera. Now, what I mentioned that we're going to be doing on the Holocaust would not be marking posts, but it will be in our search function, so that when people are typing certain terms in search, we will then encourage them to go get that accurate information off of Facebook, which is slightly different than what we did for the US Elections Center and for our COVID Information Center, which was a place on Facebook. We felt that it was best in this area to encourage people to leave Facebook. We're not the experts on Holocaust education and remembrance and historical facts. And so we'll be partnering with a very authoritative website that people will go to. They will leave Facebook and be on that website to get that information. And now that's a balance when it comes to where we want to step in and show as a company our ideas and what we think people should do in terms of accurate information, and where we want to let other groups highlight and share content to provide more accurate information. So for example, vaccine misinformation, we also do what we would call this search treatment, where when people type information about vaccines, we will also encourage them to leave our Facebook site and go to a third party and find accurate information. And so I think when it comes to these issues, I think the company needs to be very cautious and careful about where we want to step in and having our voice. When it came to, health issues and information about one's democracy and elections, I think we felt that that was a place the company was willing to go. And now with Holocaust denial, which I think is something that will be very important and part of the battle against anti-Semitism. If you just remove it from Facebook, those trends don't disappear. So we really need to make sure that we're encouraging and supporting Holocaust remembrance and education, that people have that correct information outside of Facebook.
And just to clarify, when you say that you direct them to go to a third party, do you give them the third party or curate it, or is it just that then it's suggested that they go and do a Google search, or will you have the resources there?
As much as I would like to give you guys a news headline, I can't share where we'll be directing people to yet, but hopefully we'll be able to share it soon. We've partnered with an organization, and there will be a link encouraging people to go, please visit X website in order to receive accurate information. So it won't just be sending people out into the wild west of the internet, but we will be directing them to a specific location.
Okay. And just on the sort of the question of the elections and all that, we've had a question from Alex, who's on the Zoom, saying, could you please shed some light on why social media, for example, censor the US president and not Iranian leaders that call for Israel to be wiped off the map?
I'm sorry, we didn't censor anyone, so I'm wondering what the question is exactly.
Well, I suppose that there would, is there I take this question to mean, is there, a selection that that perhaps people would think that, maybe some things do get taken off, but there are other things that don't get taken off that should get taken off. But I suppose that goes back to your earlier point about, always trying to improve.
We don't remove content really from politicians unless it's violating our community standards. Obviously, if a politician or a world leader, is saying hateful things or calling for violence, et cetera, we will remove that. But I would say we have very different policy here. I assume the question is aiming towards Twitter here, and I don't want to start criticizing other companies, but I think there's been a huge emphasis recently in the news on Twitter maybe putting labels on certain politicians' ideas and not on others, which is what I think is hinted in the question. Facebook hasn't done that when it comes to world leaders, and so I think that our policy is actually quite consistent, and I think we can stand by that.
Yeah. I wanted to move on for a little bit because you did work in Bibi's office. Did you want to tell us a little bit about your time there and what you did while you were working there?
Sure. First, it was a huge privilege. I made Aliyah, and about a year and a half later, I was working down the hall from the Prime Minister. So I would say, it's not a normal Aliyah experience. As I mentioned earlier, I met Ron Dermer, who's now our ambassador, Israel's ambassador in the United States, right before I made Aliyah. And he took me to start working for him during the campaign in 2008. And when I started working for him in 2009, I then stayed in that office through 2013 when I went to Washington. And during my time there, I did many different things. One of them, of course, was working with the diaspora Jewish communities around the world, working with the Prime Minister on a variety of different issues related to international media. I had the privilege of working with your famous Australian Mark Regev, who also was able to be an amazing colleague of mine when I worked there. And so, anyone that's worked in politics knows it's a bit of this and a bit of that. But I did have the privilege and opportunity to focus on many issues, on the Jewish communities around the world, which was wonderful. Times have changed. I've been out of government now for quite a while, but what's really amazing is that in my current position, I also still work with many government agencies. I work in the Knesset. I speak in the Knesset very often at different hearings. I've just recently met with the new Minister of Diaspora Affairs, work with different government ministries, and it's really nice to see, I would say, that the Israeli government has invested so much more than the time I was there. In diaspora, I think there's so many more people and resources. Even just the development of the internet is so different than it was in 2009. I remember sitting in the Prime Minister's office helping to set up his Facebook page. It wasn't there. So I don't mean to date myself, but I think that even just the way we communicate with one another has changed so drastically since the time I was there. One of the things that I remember doing after the Prime Minister's first speech in the United Nations when I worked there was we printed a booklet with the text of the speech. He wanted to be able to give it out to people. Many people know that Netanyahu's speeches at the UN are always quite a big affair, and he likes to share them. And we made printed booklets I'm really unclear if we would do that in 2020 if I was still working in that office, but we were working with a printing press. And so things have just changed over time. I would say that the years that I had there were, extremely valuable. I was very lucky to, have that kind of opportunity to work in that office, to have someone the caliber of Ron Dermer really mentor me and open those kind of doors for somebody as a new citizen, as a young female, weren't necessarily the easiest doors to open. And so I find myself really lucky to be able to look back on that time.
Yeah, it's a beautiful Aliyah story. And I'd like to, we have lots of Olim, and especially surprisingly now during COVID, we've seen a real uptick in people wanting to make Aliyah. And, I don't want them to think that they're all going to end up in the Prime Minister's office, but I'd like them all to be able to dream as well, because it's a great opportunity. Do you feel like, I feel a little bit like when we talk about the diaspora, that it's very US centric, and you're American, so you may see it or not. Do you feel like there was a lot of buy-in from like all of the diaspora communities, or was it US centric in that sense?
I don't think so. When I look back at my time there, I think, there was, especially during that time, huge rise in anti-Semitism in Europe. And I think that if anything, people have been shocked in recent years that there's actually anti-Semitism in America, because people were so focused on what was happening in France and in the United Kingdom. And so I hear what you're saying in terms of it being so focused on the US. Maybe in terms of numbers, just because there's more Jews there. But I would say in terms of looking at trends and being concerned about things, I think what's been so fascinating is the focus on looking at the US as, a place where there's anti-Semitic attacks. I mean, I think that's why Pittsburgh shocked so many people, because, people were so focused on looking at the US for different things, but not necessarily these kind of anti-Semitic attacks that people in the rest of the Jewish community outside of the US maybe had been experiencing already. And I think that's why so many of us in the Jewish community have tried to kind of take a step back and look at what are those kind of things uniting us. Where in the Israeli government should they be focused on resources to the diaspora? And are those voices being heard? One of the great things in my job is that I'm relying on so many amazing Facebook policy team members in those countries. So, before meeting with you, I met with my amazing team in Australia, because I'm not an expert in what's happening in Australia. I do know a lot about the Jewish community in Israel, but they know much more about what you're dealing with on a local level. Same with our team in France and in London, et cetera, Warsaw. And so I think that combination of understanding about what the local issues are, understanding the global ones, are really important. From what I've seen, I was recently in the Knesset Aliyah and Diaspora Affairs Committee. There was a very global discussion. It wasn't very focused on the United States. But, I think it depends on what's happening in the world. And so hopefully that kind of answers what you think.
Yeah, look, that's true. And perhaps, there's more of a focus on the US or on Europe because there's more going on there. And here in Australia, like foot, but we should feel privileged that we're in the lucky country, and there's probably less pressing issues. While there is important issues, of course, and I wouldn't want to overlook them. We just
know a lot more about them. So I'm hoping that the meeting today is just the start to seeing how us at Facebook can be more supportive of you guys.
Yeah, for sure. I'd love to have a chat with Facebook. We've had a question here, and it sort of touched on it earlier. It's just going back to Facebook for a second. Rachel asked that in the past she's reported anti-Israel and anti-Semitic posts and or hate pages on Facebook. And I get a reply, as I said to you before, this does not contradict our community policies. So I really would like to know who sets those community policies and who is the community referred to therein.
Sure. Okay, so first, I'm sorry for your personal experience if you haven't had a good one reporting content, not just to you, Em, but to Rachel, who I think just asked that question. And obviously, it's not our goal for you to report something that you feel is hateful and to have a negative response. So two things. One, it could be that the content that you were reporting actually doesn't violate our community guidelines. Number two, it could be that we made a mistake. And as I mentioned, over the years, we didn't always have an appeal process. We now do. And so hopefully you've been able to also appeal content and see if any of that content, the decisions were overturned after you appealed them. When you report content, it will be reviewed sometimes by a person and sometimes by technology. It will depend. Sometimes that technology feeds content into human review. So if the technology isn't clear, it might put it in a queue into, sorry.
Oh, good.
Into being able, I made it 54 minutes without water. Into being able to be seen by a person or on the appeal by a second person. This is something that we're working on improving in terms of that experience of people having enough context to understand either when their content was removed, why it was removed, or if it wasn't removed, why it wasn't removed. That takes a lot of work on the technical side, and we've made a lot of improvements on that. I think what would be interesting to find out is to really look at our community standards. I'm not sure, Rachel, if you've read them, but to really delve into them and see if you think that that content violates a specific part of our community standards, or maybe if it was ignored because it doesn't, but it's kind of content that you think should. That's the kind of content that we're always looking at and reevaluating if our policies are striking that right balance between content that you might not like and might be offensive or crosses into what we would see as violating our community guidelines. And so I would say that we're constantly improving on this. If people don't have a good experience in that, I'm sorry, but it's why the company has invested so much time in technology and people to improve this. It's really important to us. And again, as I mentioned, I'll say this stat again, because it's a really huge number, 35,000 people working on safety and security around our platform. Not all of them are content reviewers. They're people who are also keeping bad actors and bad behavior off of the platform. All of that is really important into making sure that you have a safe experience on Facebook, which is what is really our interest in every way, shape, or form. It's not in our business interest at all for you to have a bad experience on our platform. We want you to have a good one. So hopefully it will improve.
And one of the other questions, and I thought about this as well, is there monitoring just in English, or is there, monitoring in other languages as well?
Oh no, we have over 40 languages that we monitor in. If it's a language that we don't have a specific person in, we will make sure to find. Sometimes there's a very minor language that we don't have a full-time person in, we will find somebody to look at that content. And we have people who are both experts in language and people who are experts in issues. So for example, sometimes you don't need to have a language to check content. The image itself might be violating. Sometimes we need someone who's an expert. It could be in, for example, self-harm. We have suicide experts. We have people who are experts in dangerous organizations and terrorist organizations to work with people who are language experts so that when content is reported to us, we're not just taking someone who happens to know the language, but also someone who knows that field in which the violation might be. And those experts all work together in different centers to help and support each other when we have those kind of reports.
Yeah. And now this is probably going to be the most important question, Jordana, of our whole chat. We've had a question here. Are you Facebook friends with Mark Zuckerberg?
I'm not, but I should really friend him after this conversation.
Yeah, you say that the Aussies asked for it, so.
You might have reached the friend limit. I'm not sure, but.
Yeah. You only allow 5,000 or something, so. Might have to for you. We're sort of running out of time, but I just wanted to quickly ask again, just go right back, because you said that I've heard that there are two Facebook offices. So we've discussed sort of the one you work in. What was the other one in Israel?
Oh, so I actually work in both.
Yeah.
The fun part of my job is I get to sit in both offices. So just to wrap up, and I'm inviting everybody from the CFA to come visit us when you guys are in Israel again after COVID. We have a business office. That's for people who know Tel Aviv on Rothschild Boulevard. That is our office that focuses on supporting small and medium-sized businesses and startups and really taking businesses and helping them to grow and succeed. Kind of those Israeli companies that we're also proud of when we talk about the startup nation and the high-tech centers of Israel. Those companies really have grown and developed to be global powerhouses with the support of our platform, and we're really proud of that office and people that do work there, in addition to helping local businesses in Israel who are really suffering, especially right now because of Corona, and helping them to really get digital and make sure that we can really support the economy in that way by helping people to grow their business, whether it be a tech startup or whether it be a shoe store. The second office that we have is in Serona, in a new area if anyone has been there, which is our tech and engineering site. We only have 2 of those outside of the United States. in London and in Israel. So we're very proud of it. And that office's focus on connecting people to the internet. We have a product there called Facebook Lite, which is headquartered out of Israel. It's actually based on an Israeli technology that we acquired back in 2011, I believe, called Snap2. Facebook Lite helps to provide a much lighter version of Facebook. So people who are not on sophisticated internet networks, don't have 4 or 3G even, don't have very advanced smartphones, are still able to connect to social media and be a part of what we would look at the internet revolution. It's important to remember that only 59% of the people in the world are connected to the internet. The mission of the Tel Aviv tech office is to help connect more people to the internet and bring more people online. So I think it's a beautiful story to see that in Israel, Israeli engineers working for Facebook are trying to do that.
And that's obviously unique to Israel? Are there other ones like that around the world, or?
We have several R&D centers in the United States, also in London. What's unique about Israel is that we have some of our products that are headquartered there and run start to finish, like Facebook Lite, which is really what I would call blue and white product, not blue and white from Facebook, but blue and white from Israel.
Yeah, I love that. Unfortunately, Jordana, we've run out of time. I could chat with you about this for another few hours, but I'm gonna move it over to Bren to finish it up. Thank you.
Thanks, Em.
Jordana, thank you, Em. Thank you. Look, this has been wonderful, and you've clearly got a fan on our Facebook feed. I've got someone asking, first of all, when you're running for the prime ministerial position in Israel, and then earlier in that said that you're a genius. So I'm not sure if that's your husband or someone at work who wants a raise or a genuine fan, but look, really, this has been a really fascinating, interesting conversation. Someone else commented just now, she thinks Facebook has come a long way, especially recently, and it's really reassuring to hear you tell us about it. I completely agree. There were so many things in there that I didn't know, and just, I don't know, all those efforts that you talked about to not just to respond to the reporting of hatred, but to hunt them down and to use all the advances in AI and all the rest of it to find that and to stop it and delete it before people see it is really important. So thank you for spending an hour with us tonight or this morning in Tel Aviv, and that's it really. Have a wonderful week, and thank you.
Thank you guys. Good night, Australia.
Bye.